welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Welcome to our community chat. Joining me today are ICT and gender consultant, mentor, and motivational speaker Ayanna Samuels, and Gerard, who was on our very first community chat and is a communication specialist and journalist who writes extensively on Caribbean telecommunications and ICT issues. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. Pleasure to be here.
In this community chat, we'll be discussing the following three topics. First, gender equality in STEM and in the ICT sector in the Caribbean. Second, community networks. And finally, is the Caribbean truly ready for innovation? Okay, Ayanna, you're up first. Much has been made, particularly in the Americas, about the limited number of girls who are studying STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects, and making careers in ICT. You seem to be particularly concerned about the gap that exists in the region. Tell us more.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it really is very exciting for me to have a platform to speak on this issue because there are many amongst us, especially within the region, that may be used to a certain level of passion and enthusiasm from our girls and women and may not think this is an issue within the region. But what we find is that as we go up the value chain in the ICT sector, in the STEM industry, the number of women in decision-making positions really moving the envelope is not, shall we say, equal to the number of men doing so. And so I do believe the gender gap as it concerns the STEM field and the ICT sector continues, and we need to make concerted efforts to address this, as I mentioned before, especially in positions of power where you're really able to dictate the future of the industry. If one were to look at the reasons behind this persistent gender gap, we would have to go back to the nascent stages of stereotypes that we set for girls and boys from the youngest of ages. And what research I have conducted has found is that even in the toys we give our children at the stages of toddlers and babies, we begin to define for them what their roles should be. And so we find that the persistence of issuance of quote-unquote dolly houses to girls and toys to boys that may help them in their hand-eye coordination and their, shall we say, beginning of the processing of a relationship between the effort that they put in to, say, move a joystick and the speed at which the instrument that it's linked to will go, helps them to begin to work on key attributes of success in the STEM industry. And so we find that when students now get to the point where they're choosing their CSEC subjects in the fourth form, there may be somewhat of a shying away from what is seen as more robust subjects. And if we move out of the region and move internationally, I had the pleasure of having my tertiary education at MIT. I remember when we were choosing our majors, there were still decisions between what was seen as the soft subjects, of subjects like biology, etc., and the more robust subjects like aerospace engineering, which is what I pursued, that people still sort of shied away from, and certainly more girls and boys shied away from. So I think it's the elephant in the room that we need to develop policies to gender mainstream or approach around education, and even around this question of pre-education awareness of parents and churches and all institutions that touch our young to realize that this is still something we need to work on.
Excellent, Ayanna. Gerard, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I haven't had the pleasure of speaking about that, sort of addressing that topic in the coverage that I've done of the Caribbean sort of internet development scene. Over the last few years, I have not tackled that directly. I was at the LACNIC meeting in Havana, in Cuba, where Ayanna spoke directly to that topic. I might be getting that. Am I getting that venue and date correct?
You are. You absolutely are.
Yes. So I do recall the interest in the room at that time. I remember it being an all-female panel of I think there was a young lady there who was also speaking to the need for more female voices to be documenting the development of the internet. I think she was based in Argentina.
Right, and she is heads up Wikipedia there. And she was even speaking about perhaps the humility with which we tend to raise our girls, leading to enough women, and I'm guilty of it, not taking the time to set up Wikipedia pages and really allow themselves to be a voice to inspire others. We tend to have the success of women interred with their bones, and that tends to cut across cultures, interestingly, Gerard.
Yeah, so I was about to say that I think that the issue that you're touching on fundamentally, it's a cross-cutting issue that goes so far beyond the issue of internet and internet development. It might be that the internet as an industry has provided a pool, a sample from which people can sort of corroborate some of what we already know anecdotally. But I suspect that issue is one that exists across many different sectors.
Right. And for me, that only highlights the seriousness of the issue, because it means that we need to have all hands on deck, not just individuals who are in the field of STEM, but government ministries across the board, stakeholders from the bottom up across the board, to acknowledge that this is a persistent, shall we say, way of thinking that can affect women and men and their approach to grabbing opportunities, and consequences will invariably include untapped opportunities for innovation, efficiency, and business opportunities along the ICT value chain, with this disparity continuing.
So I have a question, especially since I know that you do a lot of work in trying to nurture students, prospective university candidates that are looking to matriculate into major institutions. Correct. Are you still finding that probably from whether it's engineering or what you may call, some of the more robust subjects, that women are, at least in the region, women are not taking up those sorts of positions or pursuing those courses?
Yeah, in fact, what I'm finding, Michelle, I also interviewed students for admission to MIT for a few years, and I'm having very little women even presenting themselves for consideration for admission, to then be able to pursue those subjects. And so it becomes very glaring for me. And what I find interesting, I feel like if you or I or Gerard were a fly on the wall in most of our leading Caribbean high schools, there would not be that much of a disparity in science classes in sixth form and in fifth form. But the numbers then who then throw their hat in the ring for admission to MIT has become very different. There's quite a disparity there. And so this issue really does persist, and I am able to see it in the flesh, yeah.
The question, though, that I'm wondering is really to the extent to which it's all about, socialization and nurture, because clearly girls have the aptitude, at least up to high school. You may find that girls are excelling, in, science and mathematics, etc. So it's not a question of whether or not they have the capability. Right. But basically it boils down to whether, a certain amount of intimidation that they may feel in respect of, pursuing, STEM subjects at the tertiary level, and also in terms of, the career path that they do take thereafter. Right. One of the things I noted, there was a TED talk by, I believe her name is Reshma Sojani, who was the creator of the Girls Who Code initiative. Okay. And she was saying that at least what the observation has been is that women are trained to aspire for perfection. Yes. As opposed to just being brave. So the point she was making is that women are being conditioned and socialized to be perfect, whereas boys are being taught to be courageous, to be bold, to take risks. And therefore you find that this then contributes to the disparity that we are seeing in the women who are pursuing STEM courses and going into ICT.
I think that's such a brilliant point, and I actually think I saw the same TED Talk, and she brought up an interesting point of a professor who would give homework relating to computer science, and he found that the boys who came in for office hours would say, "Prof, there's a problem with the code. I can't seem to make this work." But the girls who came in would say, "Prof, there's a problem with me. This isn't working." And so that shows you how much the women who are brave enough to take on computer science in university, etc., still have this feeling that perhaps they don't fully deserve to be in the room, and the first opportunity they get to question their validity emerges through their vernacular around how they are approaching challenges that will come along the way. And so I remember her point was, just us encouraging girls to be brave, to know that you will trip, but it's okay. And it comes right back to your point about the intimidation. If you have been socialized to feel like, perhaps this is not an area in which you can excel and you're kind of swimming out of your lane, then it's easy for you to be intimidated, and then you may begin to question yourself and think, oh no, something is wrong with me if something doesn't work. And so I'm really thrilled that you brought up this example, because this is what I'd love all of us who touch and affect girls and boys to keep in mind, that everybody should be encouraged to be brave. Everybody should be encouraged to get out there and to play. One thing that we tend to do, especially as puberty tends to set in, is that we lock our girls in. And so they're not out there riding their bicycles, learning to socialize, falling, tripping, realizing that the sky doesn't fall down if something goes wrong. And all of those things are important in developing the holistic individual, who will then be able to take entrepreneurial risk, who will then say, you know what, I want to be a rocket scientist and I'm going to pursue aerospace engineering. All those things are connected. And so I'd like us to just vibrate at a higher frequency in realizing that we are raising individuals who are under this pressure to be perfect, and in so doing, they are not capitalizing on all the wonderful opportunities that obtain within the STEM and ICT field.
Indeed. Gerard, you may have anything to add before I jump back in?
Oh, sure. I mean, my mind is tracking to the wider context in which the conversation is taking place. I know that the issue of imbalances in the industry might be the starting point of where Ayanna sort of launched the conversation, but where we've gotten to in the discussion about girls being kept indoors during puberty, and that sense of just an overarching concern for the safety of our young girls.
Yes.
I do feel as if that wider context is the elephant in the room. There's the fact that we do live in societies where there is a disparity between the performance of our female students in the formal education sector, and the fact that we celebrate, certainly in Trinidad and in other Caribbean countries, you actually see that disparity consistently, where the girls outperform the boys in terms of formal education, and their grades in the CSEC and sixth form exams are consistently better, and the rates at which they graduate seem to be higher. But at the same time, you also live in a society in which culturally certain gender norms do exist. There is a persistent trend of, certain kinds of intentional behavior and violence towards women. And that's a reality that persists in spite of, certain kinds of education and certain kinds of behavioral shifts that are being encouraged. We do live in a Caribbean society in which some of those gender norms and some of those behaviors are very persistent. I mean, I have seen in some of the newsrooms where I've worked, and this was prior to the trend of the Me Too movement. This was not a part of a social media trend or anything, but I did witness, and I was, had to sort of be an unfortunate, I had to play a role in dealing with the fallout of women who did come forward and say they were uncomfortable in the newsroom environment because of, in spite of their being star reporters or, investigative journalists, that they did not feel comfortable working late hours with certain kinds of people on staff, or they did not feel comfortable traveling with certain kinds of people, going out into the country with certain kinds of drivers and that kind of stuff. So you live in a society and you live in a culture in which those are some of the things that women are thinking about, where men are probably thinking about, well, I wonder what the score is in the cricket game. Women are probably thinking about, I hope I don't find myself in a compromising situation with this guy who's driving this car to get me to my next assignment, So, I mean,
that's very real though.
It's a very real conversation to be had that goes far beyond the issue of the performance of our women and girls in the formal education sector, or the appearance of certain kinds of statistics or changes in the internet industry itself. There are certain very fundamental cultural and societal changes that we want to see happen as well as part of that wider conversation.
Okay, the point, just piggybacking off what Gerard said, and it is the thing though that I think the reality for many women is that they know that they cannot have it all, and based on the societal norms, there is still a lot of value placed on women who are, or adult women who are in committed relationships, who are married with children. And oftentimes we are socialized as women to step back to so that your family can thrive. And right. Therefore I think that going to Sheryl Sandberg's book, Leaning In, and she had raised that issue where, I think as young women begin to think about their career paths, they probably look at what they think they can step back from as they choose to embark upon having families. And therefore, what you may find is that, one, if they're going into engineering subjects and those sorts of robust subjects, they operate at a very junior level, and they would not necessarily be the first to seek to be promoted up into senior managerial and executive positions, because they want to be able to accommodate a certain kind of life, which oftentimes is what society says is required for them to be considered successful.
Right. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I have had this happen to me myself. I have run into older women who could be mentors, and we have spoken about, my career path thus far. And they've said to me, wow, you just need to get married now, and you will do a lot better if you were Mrs. Something, and they do mean well, but this is absolutely what they feel. And if the same thing had been said by a man, it would have been like, you're doing so well, this is wonderful. What is next on your, sort of assessment of the trajectory of your career? And so it becomes very difficult for the new age woman to find sounding boards that accentuate her, because we are completely changing the paradigm. And so between that and the points Gerard made, which I just want to, reach through the podcast and hug him, I was so touched, because those are experiences I have absolutely had. Individuals who could have been mentors have introduced to topics into the discourse that showed me that we were not on the same plane at all in respect of what they wanted to have obtained in order for a mentorship relationship to continue. And by the same token, I have women who are brilliantly successful doing their thing, who I hear say to me, oh, they really would like to be able to find a man with this and that and this kind of attribute, which, are not attributes that, shall we say, they would have been born with. They don't easily determine. And so even in terms of their full self-actualization, you find communication making it clear that they feel that if they don't find a man with this or that attribute, they're not whole. And so it's coming from even the personal beliefs about ourselves, and then the messaging we're getting from others.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. I think with that seems as if we might be at a good point to move on to the next topic.
Yeah.
Okay. So up next, community networks. The topic community networks was first brought to our attention in our very first interview, which was with Shannon Osepa of the Internet Society, where the promotion of community networks to connect the still unconnected to the internet is supposed to be one of the main areas of focus of that organization. So, Gerard, are community networks something you believe Caribbean countries can benefit from? Why did you propose this topic?
Well, I attended the most recent Canto event, which was their annual conference and trade exhibition. That was held in Panama City from July 22nd to 26th. And as a part of that event, Shannon Osepa, who you mentioned, he's the Regional Affairs Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Internet Society. Shannon moderated this panel with 3 speakers, and the topic was community networks. I sat in on the session and left really impacted by what I thought was, what I saw was the potential for community networks to provide internet access to underserved and unconnected communities in some of our poor and remote and difficult to access communities. Let me talk a little bit about who was on that panel and just kind of speak to what was said in that Canto conference. So on the panel were Jane Coffin, who's the Director of Development Strategy at the Internet Society. There was another panelist whose name is Adriana Lambardini. She is a former commissioner at the telecommunications regulator in Mexico. And the third panelist was Nicolas Pace. He works with an organization called Alter Mundi. And I believe that organization is responsible for the deployment of community networks in some parts of Central America, but they've also, I believe, done some work in Dominica following the most recent catastrophic hurricanes in the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season here in the Caribbean. So it was a sort of multi-stakeholder panel in that sense. Jane Coffin predictably sort of spoke to the need for several different parts of the society, of the internet stakeholder community to work together to explore different kinds of strategies that would work in different kinds of societies. Governments have a role to play, policymakers, the private sector as well. And that issue of the private sector was one that Adriana Lambardini picked up on when she spoke as a regulator, speaking to some of the ways in which the private sector needed to be incentivized to make community networks possible. Because, and this is the key issue, is that many community networks are in fact not-for-profit operations that are specifically designed to address the issue of market dominance by larger commercial providers. And I think those kinds of conditions would ring true for in many of our Caribbean territories here. We have small markets and, one or maybe two dominant incumbent providers. What Nicholas Pace said when he began to describe some of the work that his organization was doing was that in some of the poorest and unconnected communities, the community networks that were being deployed were very similar to the community networks that were being deployed in urban settings in developed countries like the United States, in places like New York and San Francisco. And so that to me sort of blew the lid off the concept that this was something that had to be done in a sort of inferior way or something like that. It really is about simply having a different kind of approach to providing the kind of service that we all want our communities, that we all think our communities deserve. I did some additional reading around the topic of community networks, and what I've found is that, just to give a bit of wider context, only some maybe 50% of the world's population has internet access, and that we tend to think of the Caribbean as a region that can potentially be left behind. In that sense, we're not alone. We're actually part of a worldwide community of people who are clamoring for or who need to have internet access. And one of the things that, from my perspective, you guys would know that in the way that I kind of tackle the issue of internet development, it's never just about the internet. For me, I always think of the internet as this lifeline that gives communities access to, necessary services, the type of life that we think that we deserve, right?
Right.
Online business, telehealth, distance learning, online education, the ability to vote, the ability to be politically engaged, the ability to access government services, the ability to keep our kids safe. That's what I think of when I think of the lack of internet access being equated to communities being left behind. It's not just about having the best internet and the fanciest devices. It's about actually having a certain quality of life. And that's where I think community networks offer a solution. These are networks that are built by the people who live in that community, working together, combining resources, organizing themselves to create the connectivity that they need. Of course, in some cases, they can be deployed in times of crisis. So I know for us in the Caribbean, we tend to think of the Atlantic hurricane season as our time of greatest risk across the entire region. And certainly the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season did leave certain parts of our region devastated. So it does provide just this immediate test case of, can this be something that can be done to provide connectivity, not just as a matter of a post-crisis solution, but even on a more permanent basis. The elephant in the room, of course, and this was addressed several times during the course of the panel that I mentioned at the start of this contribution, is the fact that these community networks have to coexist. Let's use the word coexist. Have to coexist with traditional commercial service providers. And you're essentially in a situation where you're providing non-profit local access, but you're coexisting with mainstream commercial provider networks. But here's the thing is that those commercial providers, generally, there are certain kinds of communities that it is very unlikely that those commercial service providers are going to extend to, whether it's for reasons of geography or income or logistical topography, the topography of the area, the remoteness of the area. There are lots of reasons why someone would do a cost-benefit analysis and determine that it is not worth the investment to provide access to a certain type of community. And community networks can provide a solution in some of those cases where those kinds of situations exist in the Caribbean. That might be a type of from the ground up approach that can help to complement the top-down approach of commercial service providers. And there are a few additional benefits as well, because these are the kinds of networks that provide this sort of local business opportunity that could help to keep profits local. I know that's another big concern. And can also help to build capacity by providing training for the users of the network. Can also reinvest some of the proceeds and some of the profits of the business back into the local community. So just, I suppose, philosophically and architecturally, it's a concept that I find fits very well into the framework of internet development in the wider sense in which we talk about it as development journalists, as the internet as providing a lifeline to a better quality of life that people deserve. Community networks seem to sit very well within that wider philosophical framework.
I really liked the points that you brought to the table, Gerard. What particularly appeals to me is this idea of bottom up. And once I hear communities being able to have bottom up instruments, then it becomes clear to me that they get to define solutions to their most pressing issues and apply innovation to their needs to, as you say, be educated, be socially and politically engaged, and use the internet as an instrument for income earning, socioeconomic development, etc. And the power of that, continues to be extremely relevant. From my personal experience, I have seen community networks come into arenas, or shall we say communities, where their objective was to, say, in one specific example, teach greenhouse farming to banana farmers, only for it to be found that literacy and numeracy were the most pressing concerns, which they knew would open up the scope for opportunities across the board. And that was facilitated in very personal setups where one had a headphone, so no one needed to know how far you were along your literacy journey. And so people were confident to engage with it. And it redounded to unbelievable success because now people felt empowered across, shall we say, different sectors to take advantage of different sectors. And it really showed me how much a community network is so pliable and is a must-have in our desire to make the most of what ICTs have to bring to address community needs. And so I'm happy that you brought it squarely back on the table. It's not something that sort of has, seen its prime and we need to move beyond. It remains relevant, and we need to address that elephant you mentioned, that because it is not coming from the providers themselves, we have to be the ones to drive it, whether it's from our universal service funds, etc., to ensure it remains a major tranche in the, shall we say, setup of communities to help them to arrive at their socioeconomic development goals.
A question, Ayanna, and Gerard, I don't know if you have any perspective on this. When the community networks are set up, how do they connect to the internet itself?
Right, so there's different kinds of community networks. Generally, they're fairly small, servicing, say, a population of, say 3,000 or less. They've been deployed in different parts of the world, so there are lots of different kinds of configurations for them. A community network may or may not be connected to the
internet.
To the internet in that sense. You can have a community network that provides connectivity simply for a specific region. But you can also, as you're asking, have a network that then connects back to the wider internet as well. I suppose there might be a couple ways that could be done, and that might depend on the nature of the relationship between the operators of the community network and the operators of the commercial network in the area.
That's what I thought. Since I think, at least certainly from the Internet Society's perspective and what I understood, it was really about trying to get more people online. So ultimately, it would be about those networks connecting to the internet itself. So I wondered about that. And I guess in the region and maybe in many of the countries, maybe the larger ones where there might still be, significant areas that have little or no telecommunications coverage, that the community networks might be most relevant. But from just internet connectivity, I'm thinking that many Caribbean countries, based on the coverage that most of the telecommunications operators already provide, that especially through the mobile telecommunications services and networks, that there is the potential for people to be connected to the internet, through having, mobile broadband and mobile data services in their area. It may not necessarily be the fastest or the best, but the capability would be available in many countries, and even in what might be relatively remote geographic pockets. So I guess I'm still in two minds as to whether the extent to which community networks are going to be truly effective in the region outside of probably, let's say, countries like Guyana and maybe Belize, and certainly in the aftermath of natural disasters, whereby the commercial infrastructure may have been compromised.
Right. So there's a couple of things that I would sort of say there. One would be, I always come back to this idea of the internet as a network of networks, right? A network of connected networks. So one of the first things that needs to happen is to create networks where networks don't exist. So if there are communities that are remote, that are underserved or unconnected for any number of reasons, whether it's economic, geographical, just whatever the reasons are, where those people are, that they are for whatever reason unable to attract the investment of a commercial service provider. What you don't want to have as, let's say you're the policymaker for that jurisdiction, you don't want to have limitations on your options to get those people the access that they deserve. You don't want to be restricted to only being able to provide access via commercial service providers. You want to have as many innovative ways as possible at your disposal to get those people the access that they need. And community networks represents an option that's available to policymakers that can be explored for that reason. If you are in a small market that's dominated by a large player, a large incumbent, the policymaker there has the option of allowing for access to be given via this alternative. That's the first thing. The second thing is that like everything else, so much of what we're talking about actually depends on human relationships. The technology is not a problem. Nicholas Pace, one of the panelists in that Canto panel's discussion that I was mentioning a few minutes ago with the organization Alter Mundi, the way that he described the installation of one of these networks, he said you need a pole, a source of energy, a battery, and the actual node itself just sits on that pole. Once you get that pole up in the air and it has power, it's able to provide the technology is taken care of. There are organizations around the world that provide the technology that powers this. The issue becomes, are the human relationships on the ground configured in a way that allows this thing to actually work? Are you going to be allowed to use the spectrum that you need? Are you going to be asked to jump through the hoops of a commercial service that the commercial service providers have to jump through in order to get spectrum licenses? Are you going to have clearance? Are you going to be asked to get environmental clearance certificates? Are you going to be asked to, are you going to be treated in the same way that a commercial service provider would? Or are you going to be treated differently to that? Are we as a society willing to create the kinds of relationships that allow people to get internet access in other ways? And I think those would be the fundamental things that would allow for the solutions that you're looking for to some of those questions, Michelle, and not the other way around, right? What you want to have is the ability to find solutions and not just the ability to identify problems in isolation.
Fair enough.
And on that point, Gerard, I still feel like there is an argument for supplementary services that the community networks can provide that would be difficult for you to engage, even as someone with mobile connectivity, even something as simple as printing important documents and perhaps having the operator of the community network assist in certain forms you may have to fill out that you're not comfortable with to access government services. And that still has a strong role and forms a strong component of the value add these centers bring. Of course, now we're talking about what provision of a salary for that person who would be the moderator of the community network. But I do feel that there are services that can be provided at cost that can help to ensure that that is something that would be sustainable. But I absolutely think there's an argument for the continuation of that. And if I understood your earlier question well, Michelle, you were speaking to how the internet access for these centers would be secured, how one would go about doing so.
Yes.
Is that okay? And I know we spoke about the commercial providers obviously playing a role in that space, but this is where I have found the universal service funds to really come out to bat for communities and providing that financial, shall we say, avenue to facilitate that. And so whether it is through something like that or foundations that some of the very commercial network providers have to help to fill that gap, I have found that we have found creative ways to ensure that happens. We just need to ensure, as Gerard was saying, that the relationships on the ground for all the key sectors that must come together all have the same objective of wanting to connect the unconnected. And if that is so, then we can really close the loop in an effective way as it concerns the role that community networks can play.
Excellent point. Okay, so our last topic is the Caribbean truly ready for innovation? So the jump-off point for me selecting this topic is the departure of Uber from Trinidad and Tobago, which I think happened in May. And it was just in case some of our audience are not aware of what Uber is, it's a platform which connects people who need taxi services with ordinary motorists who can deliver that service. So Uber is available in hundreds of cities around the world and entered the Trinidad and Tobago market in late 2016, early 2017. Now, as has occurred in many countries, the formal taxi businesses, were in an uproar when Uber entered the market in Trinidad and Tobago. As taxi companies tend to have a monopoly, but thanks to Uber, the supply base widens considerably to virtually any vehicle holder, resulting in customers having more choice and not being held to ransom by the local taxi companies. And in Trinidad and Tobago, what I understand is that in addition to taxis having a difficulty with Uber, it appeared that legislative amendments were necessary, such as to the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, in order to accommodate Uber and other technologically driven initiatives. However, nearly 18 months after Uber entered the market, the legislative amendments had not been implemented. And so towards the end of May 2018, Uber announced it was pulling out of Trinidad and Tobago, with the service ending on the 30th of May. Now, I guess to be clear, I'm not necessarily making a case for Uber. My concern is more along the lines of the extent to which innovation butts heads with government policies and law, although Caribbean countries are supposedly eager for innovation to be realized. And I think we know up to a point we ought to be, maybe we need to be a little bit more honest about what it is that we think we want. So just to start the conversation, whether Ayanna or you, Gerard, might want to just share some thoughts on what I've said.
I can share some thoughts. I live in Trinidad and Tobago, and I don't remember when exactly Uber picked up and left, but I was one of the people directly affected by that. I essentially depended on Uber for not so much just daily getting around Trinidad and Tobago, but more so, I suppose, just working in and around the Caribbean and depending on Uber more so for just regular travel to and from the airport. And what I understood to be the case had to do with the how safety drivers felt here in Trinidad and Tobago. I suppose it kind of circles right back to some of what I said before when Ayanna brought up that issue of the difference between how girls and women are treated in ICT as opposed to boys and men, how structurally we as societies treat those people differently. It's the same issues of crime and personal safety that ultimately took the decision out of the hands of the technology developers and the tech entrepreneurs and made it a conversation about just personal safety and crime. And I think that's what happened in the case of Uber was, I think very quietly, the drivers were not happy with the rate at which they were being, the ways in which they were being protected or not protected. And I think that was ultimately what led to them pulling out of Trinidad and Tobago. In a former life, as a full-time journalist, I did track crime in a much closer way. I did develop an open data tracker that monitored intentional homicides in real time in Trinidad and Tobago. I think over the period 2013 to early 2015 or late 2015. And although I don't have statistics that show anything more recent than that, I can say anecdotally that just generally, the crime situation in Trinidad, I'm not at all surprised that Uber pulled out, and I'm not at all surprised that crime would be among the reasons that's being sort of whispered anecdotally as to why they pulled out. I think it's another clear case of wider societal conditions directly impacting the conversation about digital entrepreneurship.
Well said, Gerard. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was actually an issue with a specific Uber driver in terms of a homicide. I remember reading about that.
That brought things to a head. It may well be that you had a straw that broke the camel's back, yeah.
Right. That underlines your point. And I think it brings us back also to what Michelle said about us really having to have an honest discussion about what we want. Because if I tell you I want a fervent garden with beautiful flowers, but I know I have a lot of rocks in the dirt and, there are lots of weeds and I don't water it, am I really invested in having a beautiful garden? And the overall environment does end up impacting what we get from what innovation can bring. And if we don't address that in a real way, then innovation will not have that fertile space to grow. And so you're absolutely correct that the total environment must be considered as it concerns our ability to innovate in this space. And as a Jamaican, our reality is even more terse. And so I share fervent concern about this. What do you think, Michelle?
No, I definitely agree. I think, with respect to crime, and certainly that is an issue, I think one of the things, and as it relates to Uber, one of the things that was quite interesting is the fact that there are probably other, I think I read up to about 5 other sort of taxi services, some of them similar to Uber operating in Trinidad. So as much as, I guess, the violence that probably some drivers who work for Uber may have experienced, I'm wondering what has been the experience of some of the other drivers, services relative to that, and whether or not probably Uber being the most prominent, at least that is where the attention has been. Nevertheless, again, I think there has to be some more discussion about just when we say we want innovation, when we say that we want wealth creation through ICT and through technology and for our countries to thrive, and this could be, a significant channel for our economic growth and development. What are the implications relative to the structures that we have put in place to facilitate that?
Right. And the structures extend beyond, of course, our security mechanisms to, just as you said, have we evolved our legislation to be accommodating of the necessary terms for the flourishing of these innovative interventions? And, we can't seek to solve tomorrow's innovation and tomorrow's problems with yesterday's solutions. And so we have to be willing to be organic and evolve that And I think you raised that point very well in respect of 18 months later, the legislation not having changed for something, for example, is saying that if you have a private license and you can't do work for hire, which obviously would be in contradiction of the terms of Uber drivers. And so
Right.
all of those points absolutely resonate with me.
Gerard?
Well, I mean, I don't know how deep you want to go. I did at some point think, I could probably just do this Uber thing full time. I have a long history of doing informal research with these unreasonably small sample sizes of Uber drivers and asking them, so how much money do you make? How tough is it? I mean, do you have to keep your day job to get this going? Do you have young kids? Is your wife happy? Do you know how to change a tire yourself? I mean, how does this actually work? So, and just from my very unscientific, very small sample size research, I did conclude that it was not the line of work for me. I did not leave my day job.
Okay.
Good for you.
Good. I think good for everyone. Not the most proficient at changing anything on a car. In fact, we had to reschedule this call today because one of our cars had a battery that needed to be changed, and I was pretty sure that was going to take an unreasonably long time just for me to do that. So yeah, I don't know how deep you want to go, but Uber is something that I did rely on very heavily, and it wasn't just a story for me. It really did. I did sort of feel the burn of, again, the enabling conditions for these kinds of advances just not being there. When I say that, it doesn't come from a place of, I'm not looking across the fence and thinking, oh, the grass is greener in, some urban environment somewhere, New York or London or something. I'm not saying it from that perspective. I'm saying that it does seem like often the conversation about how we move forward in internet-enabled industry does come right back down to foundational questions about the nature of the society that we've already built and the pillars and the foundations that already exist. How can we move forward without addressing some of the deficiencies in the foundations that we've already built?
Absolutely, because stepping away from Uber, it was just a jump-off point. So there are other things that I'm sure if we think about it, that we can identify as probably being stumbling blocks for innovation in the region. So one of them, and it's one of my pet peeves, is the whole issue of e-commerce. The fact that, we can't do a lot of the sort of commercial transactions online here in the region. So I'm sure you can think of others that, as much as we say that we want innovation, there are some significant challenges that we don't seem to see any movement by our policymakers to address them.
And for the benefit of our readers, Michelle, what are some of the most pressing commercial transactions that we can't do online that you can easily think of, please?
Well, basically, what one would may call electronic payments, e-commerce, whereby merchants, businesses, particular maybe small and micro businesses that have some sort of online business in particular. Yes. And even if you may have, brick and mortar, but you want to have an online component where people can pay for goods and services via credit card, right, with the monies being deposited in your local account somewhere here in the region. It's very time consuming and expensive, and convoluted in terms of the process and the requirements. So you find that maybe unless you are, a major operation, which, and you have deep pockets and a dedicated, resources, infrastructure, manpower to go through all of the hoops that the banks have, etc., that you find that very many small businesses in the region that wish to have people pay for goods and services online are probably trying to do it via PayPal or through some account that they have set up somewhere like in the US or Canada, where the systems already exist. And, you don't really have to think about how you can get your money from prospective customers. Alternatively, you may find that if you don't have those sorts of systems and options available, then either people have to be wire transferring money to you or or send in some sort of check. So it just becomes a burden and a barrier to you as a business taking advantage of the global marketplace in which we exist and in which we operate.
Very fair, very fair. I also know there are individuals who have sought to set up crowdfunding campaigns to support very worthy causes, but because of the inability to have locally furnished banks, of course, be a part of that solution. And obviously, a part of that question then becomes the individuals who are running the crowdfunding site and whether they have thought to open their hands to banks within the region, but how difficult would that be for them, etc. Just pointing to another example of opportunities for growth as it concerns e-commerce. So point very well taken.
Yeah, and I think this, just that word innovation, often it gets used as pointing to opportunities to do things differently using the internet. But I just wonder sometimes whether we shouldn't be thinking about ways to encourage people to think differently about the internet in the first place, like sort of like innovative thinking about the internet, having people understand why the internet is important in the first place. I'm kind of hijacking your word here, Michelle, and I'm sorry for doing this, but I feel like innovation almost like depends on something much more fundamental. Like our ability to innovate depends on, we have to be going somewhere, right? We have to be thinking about doing something to be innovating about. You're innovating about something. You're innovating in order to achieve something, right? You're trying to do something, and then you innovate in order to get that done. And I just find that sometimes as a society, we haven't yet thought about what's the thing that the internet is enabling us to do? What's the thing that technology is enabling us to do? It's like our own development agenda hasn't been sufficiently sort of like communicated and discussed, and there isn't dialogue around it to the point where people feel, yeah, this is what we're doing as a society, this is what we're doing as a nation, or this is what we're doing as a community. And so when you talk to people about innovation, it ends up being sometimes a very fragmented sort of understanding of what that word even means, because there's no common set of goals that people can kind of wrap their energies around. You know what I mean?
Yes, definitely. Anna, you have any thoughts on that before I jump in?
I think it's a part of the point you made about us being truthful with ourselves about where we are and whether we're putting the cart in front of the horse in terms of ensuring we even mean the same thing when we say innovation. And so I agree with Gerard emphatically that we need to make sure we're all in the same place in respect of what we mean by innovation and how it would be best for us to seek to innovate, whether that's ought to begin. And I'm very comfortable with that thought, with how we are even thinking about the role innovation should play in our lives. How can we innovatively think about the internet, etc.? So I do think that that's an important step back that we should make as a region.
Okay. Gerard, I definitely agree with you in terms of the fragmented thoughts and discussions we might be having on innovation, but I again wonder whether or not it points back to the policies and laws that we have in place, and thus the enabling environment. Because if we are somewhat straitjacketed in how we can perceive the internet, or right, somehow we have blinkers on or something, where somewhere we are not, we don't have the opportunity to have a full and unadulterated view, then how then do we fully appreciate what is the breadth and depth of what we can do?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I'm always struggling every time I approach a topic or I write a piece. I'm trying all the time not to over explain things, because I do feel as if a lot of the reporting that I do is really just an excuse to sort of explain why things are important in the first place. So if I'm reporting on community networks, it's really just because I think I want to try to have people understand why this is important. And so if somebody has a panel on it, I use that panel as a pretext to say, hey, this thing is important. That's why these guys are talking about it. And it's the same with innovation. I feel like when we talk about innovation in the context of the internet, if we were here, I guess 10 or 20 years ago, we may have been talking about innovation in the context of, I don't know, television or something. I don't know what. Maybe mobile phones might have been the big I don't know what it would have been, but
probably internet dial-up or something.
Internet dial-up or something. There would have been something that the technology itself is never the big exciting thing for me. The services that live on top of the technology, they're interesting. Uber is interesting. Uber is useful. I use it. but it's never the real selling point for me. The innovation is only, it only interests me in as far as it serves some deeper development agenda. And I find in the Caribbean specifically, that's something that's missing. I don't hear voices articulating the development agenda for the region in a way that's sort of consistent and accessible to different groups of people. Sometimes academics do it in their own special academic speak. Sometimes, researchers do it in their own research speak. I'm also guilty of it. I know journalists do it in our media speak sometimes. But the ability to sort of have that conversation, I always wonder why we as a region haven't really had that dialogue about that would make it clear to people what the internet is, what the benefits are, I suppose the disclaimer to all this is that I'm an old artsy-fartsy that fell in love with the internet. I'm just a big thinker and a big dreamer sometimes, and I might have lofty goals that really aren't grounded in reality, but I do want more people to understand why the internet is important. I feel as if people just get excited about things when they need to understand what the deeper issues are sometimes.
And that is why, Gerard, I don't think it's lofty or artsy at all. I think you're speaking at the ground zero level, that in order for us to capitalize on a tool, we have to really understand that tool and make sure we are all thinking the same thing when we speak about its potential and what innovation should mean for it. And I don't think we could seek to meaningfully move and evolve with this technology if we don't really all understand it and understand how it can best treat with our needs. So I think that's a basic requirement.
Yeah.
Just going back to that point, though, and your sentiments, and I agree with Ayanna, you're not artsy-fartsy, but is it, though, that there is still a certain novelty about the internet in the region? Do you think that might be the case, why we are still just enamored with it and not necessarily, it hasn't got to the point where it's the norm and we don't really think about it, and therefore we can then begin to see its potential beyond just allowing us to, go on social media or for us to, post various things, etc.
Yeah, I suppose so, right? Yes, that is true. That is true. And I think sometimes as guys, as people who operate in the industry, we might be guilty of forgetting that there's a lot of time and energy and money being invested by people to kind of flash these carrots before our eyes and keep things exciting and flashy. And there might be that works to our advantage, I think, sometimes. It's always good to have something new to talk about, like if you have a podcast, for example. And some of the fundamental, more underlying issues are less sexy, are less exciting, are less shiny. So that might be part of it too, that just the fact that, technology is exciting. Whatever Apple does next, it is going to be promoted out
shiny.
of it. Right. Their $1 trillion budget is going to make it look shiny, right?
Right.
And whatever needs have persisted over the last 2 decades are going to be a lot less shiny, especially here in the Caribbean, right? It's probably going to be education and literacy and water and access to good roads and basic infrastructure. It's not as shiny as the next iPhone is going to be, right? So that's a good point, Michelle, is just by just the nature of human nature to be attracted to what's new and what's shiny. I suppose you're always at a disadvantage from that perspective.
Okay. I think also one last point, because I think we probably need to start to wrap up. And it kind of almost goes full circle, but not necessarily just limited to girls in ICT and girls in STEM, but whether or not, or the extent to which we in the region recognize in terms of critical mass. Clearly we have those among us who will think outside the box and who will push boundaries, etc. But whether we really fully appreciate the extent to which we can shape our own destiny, our own future with the internet.
Right. Or with anything else, to be frank, just in terms of the psychology of the region. So that point is very well taken. And if I may, on your previous point of the fact that people are still very much enamored with the internet, there's also the point that people are somewhat still intimidated in certain respects, where going deeper to create content is concerned.
Yeah, that's so
tied
true.
in with your point that they may not feel that they hold their destinies in their own hands. And so when you mix that until the result is what we see now. I'm okay going on to my Instagram feed and reading it, but am I digging deep to see how I could make money from this? And so we come full circle in terms of how we socialize our young, how we make our people feel about whether they can be entrepreneurial and define their own destinies. And then that well inculcated stereotype begins to show its ugly head in various ways. And so we have to seek to make a turn on that. And these conversations begin that dialogue, which inspires me.
Great. So, folks, I think we need to wrap up. So, Gerard, I'll just give you the final word, then Ayanna, and then I'll just close.
Well, just want to thank you for having me on the call, Michelle, and enjoyed the conversation. It has expanded my own view of what I do. I think I leave this conversation understanding that my own personal mission as a development journalist is to help build a Caribbean region in which girls and boys are able to see themselves as builders of a local internet for them, by them. And I am talking about community networks as well as those established by commercial service providers, and to innovate in ways that we can't even imagine possible. I think we all feel as if we can contribute most by educating the next generation to do the things that we can't even imagine are possible.
I love that. The only thing I'd add to that is that we're not just educating the next generation, but the older folks who will look on our bright young stars and say, okay, you're doing so well, you just need to be married now. And so wherever we can raise the decibels, I see that being necessary. And I see that from as close as my beloved parents to the extended circle. So it's just about us trying to touch those with whom we interact to, shall we say, just increase the awareness and know that before the shininess of Apple became the status quo, people were where we are now, and so this is a part of the process to get to where we want to be, and it remains possible.
All right. So thank you both of you, Gerard and Ayanna, for coming on. I do think that we hopefully have had a quite stimulating discussion, and people would, be able to draw, many insights from it all. I certainly do agree that there is so much that we in the region need to do as it relates to ICT and how we perceive ourselves in the whole global conversation on the issue, and even within our own communities and society as well. So I'm intrigued to see what the future holds and, the extent to which we will be able to, more fully harness the potential that I think everybody says. And I say it like that because at this point, a lot of it is just what people are saying here in the region. And we haven't necessarily fully begun to manifest it as yet in terms of what opportunities the internet affords.
Well said. Thank you so much to both of you also. It was a pleasure to be on the program.
Thanks again, Michelle.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.